19 minutes. That's how long it took for their political victory to become their technological apocalypse. At 8 a.m., they voted me out of the company I had spent 16 years building from the ground up. At 8:19, every screen in their global operation went dark, locked behind security protocols only I controlled. They thought they were removing an obstacle to their power consolidation. Instead, they had just severed the lifeline to their entire billion-dollar infrastructure. My name is Dr. Alina Vasquez, and this is the story of how I turned their boardroom coup into their complete operational collapse. For 16 years, I had been the technological backbone of Meridian Global Systems. When I joined as a senior software architect straight from MIT, Meridian was a mid-tier logistics company with outdated systems and ambitious dreams. Their enterprise resource planning was a patchwork of incompatible software held together with manual processes and prayer. Their data analytics consisted of Excel spreadsheets that crashed when they exceeded 50,000 rows. Their global coordination was managed through email chains that created more confusion than clarity. I didn't just modernize their technology, I reimagined it from the foundation up. Working 18-hour days for the first 3 years, I designed and built an integrated enterprise system that transformed Meridian from a regional player into a global powerhouse. The system I created, which we called Atlas, managed everything from supply chain logistics to customer relationship management, from financial reporting to predictive analytics, from inventory optimization to regulatory compliance across 47 countries. Atlas wasn't just software. It was the central nervous system of a company that had grown from $200 million in annual revenue to over $4 billion. Every order, every shipment, every customer interaction, every financial transaction flowed through the architecture I had designed. The system processed over 12 million data points daily, coordinated operations across 6 continents, and generated the real-time insights that gave Meridian its competitive advantage in an increasingly complex global marketplace. But Atlas was more than just valuable technology. It was my intellectual property, legally and technically. When I had originally designed the system, I had been careful to structure the development process to protect my contributions. Every core algorithm, every architectural framework, every innovative solution was developed under consulting agreements that preserved my ownership of the underlying intellectual property. Meridian had usage rights to the system, but they didn't own the foundational technologies that made it work. This arrangement had been formalized through a series of licensing agreements that granted Meridian perpetual usage rights as long as I remained employed with the company and continued to oversee the system's development and maintenance. The licenses covered everything from the database architecture to the user interface design, from the security protocols to the integration frameworks that connected Atlas to external systems. More importantly, I had built legal and technical safeguards into the system's architecture. Not backdoors or security vulnerabilities, but legitimate administrative controls that allowed me to manage system access and functionality in case of disputes or security breaches. These controls were documented in the system specifications and disclosed to Meridian's legal team as standard security measures for protecting intellectual property and preventing unauthorized access. The safeguards included what I privately called administrative kill switches, procedures that could temporarily suspend system operations if intellectual property licensing requirements were not met. These weren't malicious tools designed to harm the company. They were protective measures designed to prevent unauthorized use of proprietary technologies in case of employment disputes or licensing disagreements. By the time I walked into that fateful board meeting, Atlas was valued at $1.2 billion by independent auditors. The system was so integral to Meridian's operations that replacing it would require 3 to 5 years of development work and cost hundreds of millions in lost productivity and competitive disadvantage. Every executive in the company understood that Atlas was both Meridian's greatest asset and their most significant vulnerability, which made their decision to remove me from the company even more staggeringly short-sighted. The boardroom was configured exactly as I had expected when I arrived at 7:45 a.m. Marcus Webb, our CEO, sat at the head of the mahogany table with his usual expression of practiced authority. Deanna Cross, the board chair and Meridian's largest external investor, occupied the power position to his right. The other 7 board members were arranged in a configuration that suggested the outcome of this meeting had been predetermined through private conversations I hadn't been included in. Kevin Liu, who had been hired 6 months earlier as deputy CTO, sat in the back corner with his laptop open, probably taking notes for whatever role he expected to play in the post-meeting environment. Kevin was technically competent, but had no experience with systems of Atlas's complexity. More importantly, he had never been involved in the foundational architecture decisions that made the system work. Alina, Marcus began once everyone had settled into their seats. Thank you for joining us this morning. As you know, we're here to discuss Meridian's technology leadership structure and some organizational changes that the board believes are necessary for our continued growth. I nodded professionally, keeping my expression neutral despite knowing exactly where this conversation was heading. I had seen the preliminary discussions in email threads I wasn't supposed to have access to, heard the whispered conversations about reducing key person risk and diversifying technical leadership. They thought they were being subtle. They were actually being transparent. Diana picked up the narrative thread. Alina, your contributions to Meridian's technical infrastructure have been extraordinary. Atlas has been fundamental to our success, and we're grateful for your innovation and dedication over the past 16 years. The setup was perfectly executed, praising my contributions before delivering the termination. Classic corporate theater designed to make the executioners feel better about their decision. However, Diana continued, the board has concluded that Meridian's continued growth requires a different approach to technology leadership. We need broader technical expertise and more collaborative management structures rather than centralized control around any single individual. Centralized control. The phrase was carefully chosen to make my expertise sound like a liability rather than an asset. They were framing 16 years of technological innovation as a problem to be solved rather than a competitive advantage to be protected. Marcus leaned forward, his tone taking on the false warmth he used when delivering bad news. What Diana is saying is that we're restructuring the CTO role to be more of a collaborative leadership position. Kevin will be taking over as Chief Technology Officer and will be expanding the technical team to reduce dependencies on any single person's knowledge. They were offering me a consulting position, Marcus continued. Reduced responsibilities, reduced authority, and undoubtedly reduced compensation, all disguised as an opportunity to focus on strategic innovation rather than day-to-day operations. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I need to understand exactly what this restructuring involves. Would I maintain oversight of Atlas development and the intellectual property licensing agreements that govern the system's operation? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Every person in that room understood that Atlas's value was tied directly to the intellectual property arrangements I had structured over 16 years of development. Change those arrangements, and you change the fundamental economics of the system. Diana's expression tightened slightly. Alina, we've reviewed the licensing structures with our legal team. We believe those arrangements can be renegotiated to better reflect institutional ownership rather than individual contributor arrangements. Renegotiated, another carefully chosen word. They wanted to strip away the intellectual property protections I had spent years building, transferring ownership of my innovations to the company while eliminating my ability to protect those innovations from misuse or unauthorized distribution. I opened my portfolio and removed a document I had prepared for exactly this conversation. In that case, I need to review the specific terms being proposed and assess how they impact my legal obligations under existing licensing agreements. Marcus's patience was wearing thin. Alina, the board has made its decision. We're offering you a generous consulting arrangement, but the leadership structure is changing regardless of your participation. The moment of truth had arrived. They were forcing me to choose between accepting a diminished role under terms that would strip away my intellectual property rights, or leaving the company entirely and triggering the licensing provisions that governed Atlas's operation. I understand. I closed my portfolio and stood, maintaining my professional composure despite the magnitude of what was about to happen. In that case, I'll need to review my obligations under the current licensing agreements and determine the appropriate next steps. Diana tried one last attempt at control. Alina, I hope you'll consider the generous terms we're offering. This transition can be smooth for everyone if we work together professionally. I met her gaze steadily. Diana, I've always acted professionally, and I'll continue to do so. My next actions will be entirely consistent with the legal agreements that govern my intellectual property and the systems built on that property. As I walked toward the conference room door, Marcus called after me. Alina, what timeline are we looking at for transitioning your responsibilities to Kevin? I paused at the threshold, checking my watch. It was 8:17 a.m. The transition is already underway, I said simply. Kevin will understand the scope of his new responsibilities very shortly. I left the boardroom and walked directly to my office, where my laptop was already connected to Atlas's administrative interface. The system's status dashboard showed normal operations across all modules. Supply chain management processing 4,000 transactions per minute, customer relationship systems handling 600 active service requests, financial reporting generating real-time updates for 47 country operations, predictive analytics running optimization calculations for next week's logistics planning. At 8:18 a.m., I opened the administrative console and began the shutdown sequence I had hoped never to use. The first command revoked the temporary usage licenses that allowed Atlas to operate on Meridian's servers. The second command activated the intellectual property protection protocols that suspended system operations until licensing disputes could be resolved. The third command implemented security lockouts that prevented unauthorized access to proprietary algorithms and databases. At 8:19 a.m., every Atlas terminal in Meridian's global network displayed the same message. System access suspended pending resolution of intellectual property licensing requirements. Contact system architect for restoration procedures. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. In London, the Logistics Coordination Center lost access to shipping manifests for 12,000 containers currently in transit. In Singapore, customer service representatives found themselves unable to access account information for clients calling with urgent delivery questions. In Chicago, the financial team discovered they could no longer generate the regulatory reports due to federal authorities that afternoon. Within minutes, my phone began ringing. Kevin Liu called first, his voice tight with panic. "Alina, what's happening with Atlas? Every terminal is showing some kind of licensing error." "Kevin," I replied calmly, "Atlas is operating exactly as designed. The system includes intellectual property protections that activate when licensing requirements are not met. Since the board has decided to restructure the technical leadership without addressing the underlying licensing agreements, those protections have been triggered. Can you fix it?" His desperation was palpable. "The system isn't broken, Kevin. It's protecting intellectual property as programmed. Restoration requires resolution of the licensing dispute through appropriate legal channels." Marcus Webb called 30 seconds after I hung up with Kevin. His practiced authority had been replaced by barely controlled fury. "Alina, you need to restore Atlas access immediately. This is corporate sabotage." "Marcus, I'm not sabotaging anything. The system is functioning exactly as specified in the licensing agreements your legal team reviewed and approved. When those licensing terms are not met, the system automatically protects the intellectual property from unauthorized use." "This is extortion," he sputtered. "No, Marcus, this is contract law. Atlas operates under specific licensing agreements that require my continued involvement in system oversight. The board's decision to remove me from that oversight role has triggered the intellectual property protection protocols built into the system architecture." Diana Cross called 5 minutes later, her investor composure cracking under the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Alina, we need to resolve this immediately. Our entire global operation is paralyzed." "Diana, I understand the urgency. The resolution is straightforward. Restore the original licensing agreements and technical leadership structure, or negotiate new agreements that properly compensate intellectual property ownership while maintaining operational continuity." "What compensation are we talking about?" Her tone had shifted from authority to negotiation. I smiled, though she couldn't see it through the phone. "Diana, given that Atlas is valued at $1.2 billion and represents 16 years of my intellectual property, I think we're talking about terms significantly different from the consulting arrangement discussed this morning." By 8:45 a.m., Meridian's crisis management team had assembled in the Emergency Operations Center. Every department head was present, along with the board members who had voted me out just 45 minutes earlier. Kevin Liu was frantically calling software vendors, trying to find emergency replacements for Atlas functionality. The preliminary assessments were devastating. Full system restoration through alternative software would require 18 to 36 months and cost between $200 and $400 million. More immediately, Meridian's daily operations were grinding to a halt. Customer service queues were backing up as representatives couldn't access account information. Logistics coordination was reverting to manual processes that couldn't handle the volume of a global operation. Financial reporting was frozen, threatening regulatory compliance in multiple jurisdictions. My phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Meridian's outside legal counsel. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Patricia Crawford from Morrison and Associates. I represent Meridian Global Systems. We need to discuss immediate resolution of the current system access issues." "Patricia, I'm happy to discuss resolution. As I've explained to Meridian's management, Atlas is operating according to its design specifications and licensed intellectual property protections. Dr. Vasquez, Meridian is prepared to negotiate compensation for immediate system restoration. That was the conversation I had been waiting for. Patricia, restoration requires more than compensation. It requires legal agreements that properly recognize intellectual property ownership and provide appropriate governance for ongoing system development and maintenance. Over the next 2 hours, I negotiated the most favorable employment contract in my career, not just employment equity partnership. The final agreement granted me 20% ownership of Meridian Global Systems, a base salary of $2.4 million annually, complete authority over all technology development and implementation, and contractual protections that prevented the board from unilaterally changing my role or responsibilities. More importantly, the agreement formalized my ownership of Atlas and related intellectual property, while granting Meridian perpetual usage rights under terms I controlled. Future system development would be structured as joint ventures with shared ownership of innovations and shared profits from licensing the technology to other companies. At 12:30 p.m., exactly 4.5 hours after they had voted me out of the company, the board voted unanimously to ratify my new partnership agreement. At 12:31, I restored Atlas to full operational status. Marcus Webb resigned as CEO that afternoon, citing personal reasons, but actually acknowledging that he could no longer effectively lead a company where the chief technology officer owned 20% of the equity and had demonstrated the ability to shut down operations with 19 minutes' notice. Deanna Cross remained as board chair, but with significantly reduced authority. The intellectual property crisis had demonstrated to Meridian's other investors that technical expertise couldn't be treated as a replaceable commodity, and that governance required understanding the systems that created value rather than just the financial statements that measured it. Kevin Liu was reassigned to a senior developer role, where his technical competence could contribute to system development without the pressure of architectural responsibilities he wasn't prepared to handle. He actually thanked me privately, acknowledging that the CTO promotion had been beyond his current capabilities. 6 months later, Meridian completed the most successful year in company history. Atlas, now properly recognized as the competitive advantage it had always been, was licensed to 3 other logistics companies for $200 million in additional revenue. My 20% equity stake was worth over $800 million based on updated company valuations. The business press covered the story as a case study in intellectual property management and key person risk. Harvard Business Review published an article titled, "When the System Owner Becomes the System Protector." The Wall Street Journal featured Meridian as an example of successful technology partnership between individual innovators and corporate investors. But the most satisfying recognition came from the industry organization that awarded Atlas the Technology Innovation of the Year, with specific recognition for the intellectual property protection mechanisms that had demonstrated the importance of proper governance for critical business systems. They voted me out at 8 a.m., confident in their political maneuvering and certain that technical expertise was subordinate to boardroom authority. By 8:19 a.m., they had learned that in technology companies, the person who built the system ultimately controls the system, regardless of organizational charts or voting procedures. 19 minutes. That's how long it took to demonstrate that intellectual property isn't just a legal concept, it's operational reality. When you own the foundations of a billion-dollar system, you own the power to protect those foundations from misuse, mismanagement, or simple disrespect. Marcus Webb thought he could restructure technical leadership without understanding technical dependencies. Diana Cross believed that investor authority superseded intellectual property rights. Kevin Liu assumed that technical titles were equivalent to technical expertise. They all learned otherwise in the most expensive 19 minutes of their professional lives. My name is Dr. Alina Vasquez, Chief Technology Officer and Equity Partner of Meridian Global Systems, architect of Atlas, and proud defender of intellectual property rights in corporate America. They voted me out at 8 a.m. because they thought politics trumped technology. At 8:19 a.m., I reminded them that in technology companies, the code is the ultimate arbiter of power. And I wrote every line of code that mattered. If this story of corporate payback resonated with you, you've found the right community. Here at Corporate Payback Stories, we share stories of professionals who refuse to be underestimated and prove that competence always defeats politics. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell if you believe that hard work and integrity deserve respect. Share this video with someone who's ever felt undervalued at work. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated in your career? How did you prove them wrong? Your professional stories inspire our community. Thank you for watching, and remember, workplace injustice meets professional justice. Until next time, stay professional, stay strategic.